Good morning. Today is Tuesday, June 13th, 2023. So yesterday we discussed how could it be that these 12 men came back with such a negative report that caused the sin of the Meraglim and disrupted the entire plan of Jewish history. What was it that they saw? What was it that they reported that was wrong? We discussed that yesterday. But another very curious feature of this difficult passage is the consequence of this sin. It's extremely hard to understand God's reaction in our parsha, the Torah portion of Shlach, why God responds the way God responds. Because in our parsha, God displays a level of exasperation and outrage that seems, on the surface, to be out of proportion to the mistake that they made. Consider this. The two greatest debacles in Jewish history during the 40 years in the desert, one is the Meraglim, the sin of the spies in our Torah portion, and the other, which was about 10 months earlier, the sin of the Egel Hazav, the golden calf. Now, both sins are terrible. But to my mind, the sin of the golden calf is much worse. It was just days after the entire Jewish people heard God directly speaking the Aseret Dibros, the 10 Commandments. Everyone heard it. And God said, Lo sase lecha fesel v'chol tumuna. Don't make any image to worship. And 40 days later, there is an Egel Hazav, there's a golden calf. It's terrible. It's very, very serious. And yet somehow, Moshe is able to eventually get God to forgive the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf. And the outcome of that entire event is Yom Kippur. We have a day of atonement where God promises us that every single year, if we come before God sincerely, God will forgive us for our sins every year. It is an annual, ongoing gift, such a positive outcome that we would not have had without the sin of the golden calf. On the other hand, the sin of the Meraglim in our parsha, okay, maybe, as we suggested yesterday from the Ishbitzer, they were looking too superficially at the land of Israel. Or like some of the other opinions I quoted to you, maybe they showed a lack of faith in God, that God would be able to take them into the land of Israel. They showed maybe a lack of gratitude for the gift of the land of Israel that God was offering them. Or maybe, they could only see the negatives, they couldn't see the positives. We've discussed all these different opinions. All right, it's terrible, it's wrong, it's bad. But the bottom line is, the decree against the Jews wasn't so much against the report brought back by the spies. That was the cause. It was because the people were afraid. Now, they were afraid. Interesting, they didn't actually disobey anything. They didn't violate any mitzvah, any command, but they were afraid. And here's the thing, people get frightened. Sometimes there's a good reason to get frightened. Sometimes there's not a good reason to get frightened. But being frightened is still the same thing. I mean, did it ever happen to you that you said to a person, or someone said to me, or someone said to you, don't be afraid. You have no reason to be afraid. Did that ever in the history of humankind ever help anybody not be afraid? A person's afraid. They're afraid. So you shouldn't have been afraid. But because the people were afraid, God gets so furious at them. There's no forgiveness. Even after Moshe intercedes in our Torah portion, and Moshe's prayer in our Parsha is almost verbatim, the same prayer that was successful in achieving forgiveness after the sin of the golden calf. And here, the prayer fails. God decrees this entire generation will die in the desert. No forgiveness for them. Only their children, only the next generation will be able to enter the land of Israel. Why is God's reaction so strict and unyielding and harsh, especially compared to God's reaction to the golden calf? So I've shared a number of answers to this question before. They're all important, but I want to share another answer today. And I want to start with a story. There was a young couple who was visiting Rabbi Yaakov Kaminetsky. Rabbi Yaakov Kaminetsky was one of the greatest Torah scholars and leaders of the previous generation. And this young couple came to visit. And this young couple had a young son, a baby son with them. And so they're sitting at the table, Rabbi Yaakov and the husband and the wife had the baby on her lap. And while they were talking, the baby climbed up onto the table and knocked over some water glasses. The parents were mortified that their child misbehaved in the presence of a great scholar like Rabbi Yaakov Kaminetsky, and they were about to get very, very angry at their child, to discipline their child, to do this in front of Rabbi Yaakov Kaminetsky, to knock over the dishes. And so Rabbi Yaakov said to them, I'd like to share with you a piece of advice. And by the way, this is a piece of advice that I think is crucial for any parent and many other situations. Rabbi Yaakov said to them, whenever you are considering disciplining a child, but you're not sure, is this a big deal or is it a little deal? Is it a big deal that requires a significant intervention response? Or is it a little deal that requires, a warning, something small? You're trying to evaluate. When you have that question in your mind, ask yourself the following question. This behavior that my child just did, am I worried that he or she will do it at their wedding? In other words, there are actions that are normal for a young child, but they will probably outgrow them. Yes, you certainly want to try to teach a child not to do those things if they're negative, but it's not as serious as an action that might set a pattern that will be continued into adulthood. That has to be treated much more seriously. And Rabbi Yaakov said to them, do you really think at the wedding your son is going to climb up onto the table and knock over the glasses? It's a minor thing. Let it be. Okay. That was his advice, and I think it's great advice. The sin of the egel, the golden calf, was a terrible sin. And there were other periods in Jewish history when Jews were drawn to idols and images. But here's the thing. It is not a pervasive, ongoing problem. Has any one of you ever had the urge to worship a cow? Be honest. It's not something, to borrow the metaphor from Rav Yaakov, it's not something that we did at our wedding. It was a mistake at the very beginning of our relationship with God. It needed correction, but it was not an ongoing flaw that God needed to be so strict about. We outgrew it, and God forgave it. The Meraglim is very different. The Meraglim is treated by God as such a much more serious sin because We all continue to do it today. We cause hysteria and anxiety and fear in our lives and in the lives of others because we choose to focus on negativism rather than positivism faced in any situation. Of course, there are positives and negatives, and so often we direct our attention to what's negative, and thereby dredge up and encourage and facilitate fear and hysteria, when we just as easily could have focused on the positive and avoided all of that. And it causes harm in every single area of life. Sivan Rahab Meir points out, for some reason, the word optimism or an optimist is considered to be someone who is escaping from reality, whereas pessimism or a pessimist is considered to be more realistic. But that is just not true. The decision of how to interpret things, whether to see the optimistic aspect or the pessimistic aspect, that is a decision that is ours at every single moment. And there is always optimism and pessimism in any given situation, person, event, etc. It's up to us to choose. And we make this bad choice all too often, even today. And so therefore, God cannot allow us to constantly make that mistake. It's a big deal. And God's response reflects that it is a mistake that we unfortunately have carried into adulthood. And this is true about how we perceive Israel. It's true about how we perceive every area of life. One of the areas that it's particularly relevant in is in marriage. At any moment, there is always something positive to focus on and something negative to focus on. God doesn't want us to ignore the negatives. God commanded Moshe to send the spies to learn how to navigate. You have to know the negatives in order to be able to figure out how to proceed. But to focus only on the negatives, that caused and still causes us hysteria and destruction. And that's why God cannot rest until we understand how serious a character flaw that is within us. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you all soon in person.